Eastlake, Ohio, a quiet suburban neighborhood on a warm July afternoon. The kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where children ride bikes on tree-lined streets, where life moves at a gentle, predictable pace. Inside apartment 2B of a modest two-story building on Lakeshore Boulevard, a 76-year-old man sat alone in his living room. The apartment was neat, almost obsessively so. Every book on the shelf was aligned perfectly. Every surface was dusted. The kitchen counter held nothing but a coffee maker and a single mug. The man had lived in this apartment for over 15 years, and in all that time, not a single visitor had crossed his threshold. His neighbors knew him only as a polite but distant figure who nodded in passing, but never stopped to chat. The mailman knew him as the man in 2B who always collected his mail promptly and never received personal letters, only bills and technical magazines. The superintendent knew him as the tenant who paid his rent on time every month and never called with complaints or requests. To the world, he was Joseph Newton Chandler III, a retired electrical engineer living out his golden years in quiet solitude. But on this particular Wednesday afternoon, Joseph Newton Chandler III had made a decision. It was a decision he had been contemplating for months, perhaps years. The weight of it sat heavy on his chest as he stared at the handgun on the coffee table in front of him. The television was off. The curtains were drawn, filtering the afternoon sunlight into dim, dusty rays. The silence in the apartment was profound, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on the street below and the occasional bark of a dog from somewhere in the neighborhood. On the coffee table, arranged with the same meticulous care that characterized everything in the man's life, sat several documents. A last will and testament, handwritten in neat, precise script. Bank statements showing a modest savings account. Instructions for his cremation, spelled out in detail. Contact information for his landlord and his bank. Everything was organized. Everything was in order. The man had left nothing to chance. He had always been careful, always been thorough. It was how he had lived for decades, and it was how he would die. For several long minutes, the man sat motionless, his hands resting on his knees. His face was expressionless, neither sad nor afraid. He had the look of someone who had made peace with what was about to happen. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached for the gun. His hands did not shake. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt. He placed the barrel to his temple, closed his eyes, and in the space of a single heartbeat, ended his life. The sound of the gunshot echoed to the apartment building, sharp and unmistakable. In the apartment next door, a young woman named Karen was folding laundry when she heard it. She froze, her hands clutching a towel, her heart suddenly pounding. For a moment, she tried to convince herself it was something else. A car backfiring, a firecracker. But she knew. Deep down she knew. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her voice shook as she gave the address and explained what she had heard. Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the quiet street. Police cars and an ambulance converged on the building. Officers rushed up the stairs to the second floor. They knocked on the door of apartment 2B, identifying themselves loudly. There was no response. They knocked again more forcefully. Still nothing. With the building superintendent standing nervously behind them, the officers made the decision to force entry. The door gave way with a splintering crack, and they entered the apartment with their weapons drawn. Calling out as they moved through the small space, they found him in the living room, slumped in his chair. The scene was exactly as he had left it, orderly and deliberate. The gun had fallen from his hand and lay on the floor beside him. Blood spattered the wall behind the chair in a dark, gruesome pattern. On the coffee table, the neatly arranged documents sat undisturbed. One of the officers, a veteran named Mike Rodriguez, surveyed the scene with a mixture of sadness and professional detachment. He had seen suicides before, too many of them, but there was something about this one that struck him as unusual. The meticulous arrangement of the room, the careful planning evident in the documents, the complete absence of any personal items or photographs. It was as if the man had erased himself even before pulling the trigger. Rodriguez radioed for medical examiner and began the process of securing the scene. His partner, a younger officer named Janet Mills, started taking photographs and making notes. They worked efficiently, documenting everything. When the medical examiner arrived, she confirmed what was already obvious. The man had died instantly from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Time of death was estimated at approximately 2:30 p.m. There were no signs of foul play, no indication of any struggle or forced entry. It was, by all accounts, a straightforward suicide. But as Rodriguez began going to the man's papers to find next-of-kin information, he felt that nagging sense that something was off. He picked up the driver's license from the table. Joseph Newton Chandler III. Born January 26, 1925, in Buffalo, New York. The photograph on the license showed a thin, serious-looking man with short gray hair and pale blue eyes. Rodriguez looked at the face of the deceased and back at the license. It matched. He found a Social Security card, also in the name of Joseph Newton Chandler III. There was a checkbook meticulously balanced with a local bank, a few utility bills, all current and paid. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Rodriguez looked around the apartment more carefully. It was a one-bedroom unit, sparsely furnished. The furniture was old but well-maintained. In the bedroom, the bed was made with military precision. The closet held a few changes of clothes, all plain and practical. Work shirts, slacks, a single suit that looked like it hadn't been worn in years. No expensive items, no luxury goods. In the bathroom, basic toiletries were arranged neatly on the counter. The medicine cabinet held a few over-the-counter medications, reading glasses, and a bottle of vitamins. Nothing unusual. In the living room, a bookshelf held an eclectic collection of titles. Technical manuals on electrical engineering, some dating back to the 1970s. A few history books, mostly about World War II. Some paperback mystery novels. Their spines creased from repeated reading. But what struck Rodriguez most was what wasn't there. No family photographs. No letters or cards from friends or relatives. No address book. No personal mementos of any kind. It was as if Joseph Newton Chandler III had no past, no connections, no life outside the walls of this apartment. Rodriguez searched for a computer or cell phone. There was none. In a world where even elderly people were increasingly connected to the internet and social media, this man had remained completely disconnected. There was a small television in the living room, an older model, and that was the extent of his electronic devices. Rodriguez moved to the small desk in the corner of the living room. He opened the drawers carefully, still wearing his gloves. Inside, he found more evidence of the man's meticulous nature. Files organized by category, bills, taxes, insurance. He pulled out a folder labeled Important Documents and opened it. Inside was a birth certificate. Joseph Newton Chandler III, born January 26, 1925, in Buffalo, New York, to Joseph Newton Chandler Jr. and Marie Chandler. There was also a high school diploma, dated 1943, from a school in Buffalo, a military discharge certificate, showing that Joseph Newton Chandler III had served in the United States Army during World War II and had been honorably discharged in 1946. Rodriguez examined these documents carefully. They looked authentic. The paper yellowed with age, the ink faded, but something about them bothered him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way they were all stored together, as if they were props in a play rather than the accumulated detritus of a real life. Or maybe it was the complete absence of anything more recent. No photographs from his military service. No letters from home. No wedding certificate or divorce papers. No evidence that he had ever been married or had children or had any family at all. Rodriguez made a note to run a background check on Joseph Newton Chandler III. It was standard procedure in cases like this to notify next of kin and ensure there were no outstanding warrants or other legal issues. But as he looked around the sterile, lonely apartment one more time, he had a feeling that this case was going to be anything but standard. The medical examiner's team arrived to transport the body. As they loaded it onto a stretcher, Rodriguez asked, "When can we get the autopsy report?" The medical examiner, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, shrugged. "Shouldn't take long. Pretty straightforward. I'll have the preliminary report to you by tomorrow. Full report within a week. Rodriguez nodded. Any chance we can get fingerprints and DNA samples? Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow. This is a suicide, right? Not homicide. Yeah, Rodriguez said. But there's something off about this guy. I can't explain it. Just a feeling. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. I've learned to trust cop instincts. I'll make sure we get prints and DNA. Just in case. As the body was taken away and the scene was cleared, Rodriguez stayed behind with Mills to finish documenting everything. The landlord, a nervous man in his 60s named Tom Harrison, hovered in the hallway. I can't believe it, Harrison kept saying. He seemed so normal. Quiet, but normal. Paid his rent on time. Never caused any trouble. I can't believe he would do this. Rodriguez asked, how long had he lived here? Oh, must be going on 16. 17 years now, Harrison replied. Moved in around 1985 or 1986, I think. Kept to himself. I'd see him now and then say hello. He was always polite, but never wanted to chat. I figured he was just one of those private types, you know? Did he ever have visitors? Rodriguez asked. Friends, family, anyone? Harrison shook his head emphatically. Never. Not once in all these years. I always thought that was kind of sad. A man living all alone with nobody. I tried to be friendly at first, invited him to a couple of building barbecues we used to have, but he always politely declined. After a while, I stopped asking. Did he have a job while he was living here? Not that I know of, Harrison said. I think he was retired when he moved in, but he always paid his rent, always on time, so I figured he had some kind of pension or savings. Rodriguez made notes of all this. Then he asked, did you ever go inside his apartment? For repairs or anything? A few times, Harrison said. Maybe 4 or 5 times in all those years. Once when the toilet backed up, couple times to check the smoke detector, things like that. Every time, the place was spotless, almost unnaturally clean. And empty, you know? No pictures on the walls, no knickknacks, no personality. It was like a hotel room. After Harrison left, Rodriguez and Mills finished their work. They took photographs of everything, bagged the documents and personal effects as evidence, and secured the apartment. As they left, Rodriguez took one last look around. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows now, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. The apartment felt less like a home and more like a way station, a temporary stop for someone passing through. But Joseph Newton Chandler III had lived here for nearly 2 decades. What kind of life was that? As Rodriguez drove back to the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. The pieces didn't quite fit together. A man with no friends, no family, no connections to the world. A man whose only possessions were a few clothes, some books, and a set of documents that, while apparently authentic, seemed almost too perfect, too carefully curated. Back at the station, Rodriguez filed his report and requested a background check on Joseph Newton Chandler III. Then he went home for the night, pushing thoughts of the lonely apartment and the dead man aside. It was just another case. Just another sad ending to a solitary life. Except it wasn't. And it would be years before anyone realized just how extraordinary this case really was. The next morning, Rodriguez arrived at the station to find the preliminary autopsy report on his desk. Dr. Chen had been as good as her word. He flipped through the pages, finding nothing unexpected. Cause of death, single gunshot wound to the right temple, self-inflicted. The man had been in reasonably good health for his age. Some arthritis, slightly elevated cholesterol, but nothing serious. No signs of terminal illness that might have prompted the suicide. No alcohol or drugs in his system. The toxicology report was clean. Dr. Chen had noted that the man appeared to have taken good care of himself. He was lean, his teeth were in decent condition, and there were no signs of chronic disease or neglect. She estimated his age at mid to late 70s, consistent with the birth date on his driver's license. Rodriguez set the report aside and turned to his computer. The background check results had come in overnight. He pulled up the file and started reading. Joseph Newton Chandler III. Social Security number issued in 1965. Driver's license, current and valid. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. No outstanding warrants. No tax liens or judgments. The man had worked as an electrical engineer for several companies in the Cleveland area from the late 1960s through the mid-1980s. His employment history showed steady, if unremarkable, work. He had filed taxes every year, always as a single filer, always showing modest income and no dependents. He had never owned property, never registered a vote, never served on a jury. He had a bank account at a local credit union, opened in 1985, with a current balance of approximately $75,000. His will, which had been reviewed by the department's legal advisor, was straightforward. He left his entire estate to the local library system, with instructions that be used to purchase books on science and history. There were no personal beneficiaries, no family members mentioned. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair and frowned. On the surface, everything checked out. Joseph Newton Chandler III appeared to be exactly who he claimed to be, a retired engineer who had lived a quiet, uneventful life and had chosen to end it on his own terms. But the complete absence of any personal connections still bothered Rodriguez. He decided to dig a little deeper. He called the Social Security Administration and requested more detailed records. It took a few days, but eventually he received a packet of information. Joseph Newton Chandler III's Social Security number had been issued in 1965, when he would have been 40 years old according to his birth certificate. That was unusual. Most people got their Social Security numbers much earlier, either as children or when they first entered the workforce. Rodriguez made a note of that. He also requested military records from the National Archives. If Chandler had served in World War II, as his discharge papers indicated, there should be extensive records. But when the response came back several weeks later, it was puzzling. The National Archives had no record of a Joseph Newton Chandler III serving in the military during the time period indicated on the discharge certificate Rodriguez had found in the apartment. No service record, no enlistment papers, nothing. Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine. Something was definitely wrong here. He pulled out the birth certificate and looked at it more carefully. It listed Joseph Newton Chandler III as born in Buffalo, New York, on January 26, 1925. Rodriguez contacted the Buffalo Department of Vital Statistics and requested verification. It took several more weeks, but the response when it came was shocking. Yes, there had been a Joseph Newton Chandler III born in Buffalo on that date. But according to their records, that child had died in 1945 at the age of 8 years old. Rodriguez stared at the email on his screen, reading it over and over to make sure he understood correctly. The real Joseph Newton Chandler III had died nearly 60 years ago. So, who the hell was the man who had killed himself in Eastlake, Ohio? Rodriguez immediately escalated the case. What had seemed like a routine suicide was now a mystery of identity. He contacted the FBI, the U.S. Marshal Service, and every agency he could think of that dealt with identity theft and fugitives. The fingerprints taken from the body were run through every database available. They came back with no matches. The man had no criminal record under any name. DNA samples were taken and entered into CODIS, the FBI's DNA database. Again, no matches. Whoever this man was, he had managed to live for decades under a stolen identity without leaving any trace of his real self. The case attracted the attention of Detective Peter Elliott, a cold case investigator with the U.S. Marshal Service who specialized in tracking down fugitives who had been on the run for decades. Elliott had seen cases of identity theft before, but this one was different. Most people who stole identities did so sloppily, and they were eventually caught. But this man had been meticulous. He had chosen the identity of a child who had died young, ensuring there would be no living person to contradict his claim. He had obtained a Social Security number in 1965, a time when record-keeping was less sophisticated and background checks were minimal. He had lived quietly, avoiding any situation that might draw attention or scrutiny. And he had succeeded in maintaining his false identity for nearly 40 years, until the day he decided he couldn't carry the burden anymore. Elliott became obsessed with the case. Who was this man really? Where had he come from? What was he running from? Over the next several years, Elliott worked tirelessly. chasing down every lead, no matter how small. He interviewed everyone who had known the man calling himself Chandler. Neighbors, former co-workers, the landlord, anyone who might have a clue. But everyone told the same story. He was quiet, polite, private. He never talked about his past. He never mentioned family or friends. He was like a ghost, present but not really there. One former co-worker, a man named Bill Stevens who had worked with Chandler at an electronics firm in the 1970s, remembered him as competent but odd. He knew his stuff, no question about that. Stevens told Elliot during an interview, he could solve problems that stumped the rest of us. But he was like a robot, you know? No personality. We'd go out for drinks after work sometimes, and we'd always invite him, but he never came. Never joined us for lunch. Never attended the Christmas party. Some of the guys joked that he was a spy or something, but we figured he was just antisocial. Elliot asked, did he ever mention anything about his past? Where he grew up, where he went to school, anything like that? Stevens shook his head. Never. I asked him once where he learned electronics, and he just said he picked it up on his own. I asked if he served in the military, and he got this weird look on his face and changed the subject. After that, I stopped asking. It was clear he didn't want to talk about himself. Another co-worker, a woman named Janet Morris, had a similar story. I felt sorry for him, she said. He seemed so lonely. I invited him to my wedding once, just to be nice, and he looked at me like I'd asked him to jump off a cliff. He politely declined and never mentioned it again. I always wondered if he'd been hurt in the past, you know? Like maybe he lost his family or something and couldn't bear to be around people anymore. Elliot pursued other angles. He looked into unsolved crimes from the 1960s, trying to find any that might match the profile of a man who would need to disappear and assume a new identity. There were several possibilities. A bank robbery in Pennsylvania in 1964 where the perpetrator had never been caught. A murder in Ohio in 1963 that remained unsolved. A kidnapping case in New York in 1965 where the suspect had vanished. Elliot compared the physical description of suspects in these cases to photographs of the man who had called himself Chandler. There were some similarities, but nothing definitive. Without DNA or fingerprints from the original crime scenes, there was no way to make connection. Elliot also considered the possibility that the man had been a spy. The 1960s were the height of the Cold War, and both the United States and the Soviet Union had operatives living under false identities. Could Chandler have been a Soviet sleeper agent? It would explain his isolation, his refusal to form attachments, his technical skills. But if he were a spy, why had he never been activated? And why would he commit suicide in 2002, more than a decade after the Cold War had ended? Elliot reached out to the CIA and NSA, asking if they had any record of a suspected foreign agent matching Chandler's description. The responses were vague and unhelpful. If intelligence agencies knew anything, they weren't sharing. Years passed. The case grew cold, literally and figuratively. Elliot retired from the Marshal Service, but never stopped thinking about Joseph Newton Chandler III. He had become personally invested, unable to let go of the mystery. In his retirement, he continued to work on the case independently, poring over old records, following up on new leads that occasionally came in, always hoping for a breakthrough that never came. Then, in 2014, a new technology offered hope. Forensic genealogy, the use of DNA testing, combined with genealogical research, was beginning to revolutionize cold case investigations. The technique had been used successfully to solve several high-profile cases, most famously the Golden State Killer case in California. Elliot realized that this technology might be the key to finally identifying the man who had called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III. He contacted DNA Solutions, a private lab that specialized in forensic work, and arranged for them to extract DNA from the samples that had been preserved from the 2002 autopsy. The lab was able to create a detailed genetic profile. This profile was then uploaded to GeneMatch, a public database where people who had taken commercial DNA tests like 23andMe or Ancestry can upload their results to find relatives. The results were both promising and frustrating. The DNA showed that the man had distant relatives in the database, people who shared common ancestors with him several generations back. But none of these matches were close enough to immediately identify him. The closest match was a fourth cousin, someone who shared a great-great-great-grandparent with the unknown man. This was helpful, but it would require extensive genealogical research to trace the family tree and narrow down possible candidates. Elliot hired a team of genetic genealogists, experts who specialize in using DNA matches to build family trees and identify unknown individuals. The team, led by a woman named Barbara Ray Venner, who had worked on the Golden State Killer case, began the painstaking process of research. They started with the closest DNA matches and began building out family trees, going back generation by generation, identifying every descendant of the shared ancestors. It was slow, meticulous work. For every person in the family tree, they had to research birth records, marriage records, census data, obituaries, anything that might help them trace the lineage forward to the present day. They were looking for men who would have been the right age to match the man who died in 2002, men who had been born in the 1920s, who had lived long enough to reach their 70s, and who had at some point disappeared from the historical record. As the genealogist worked, Elliot continued his own research. He went back over the evidence from the apartment, looking for any clue he might have missed. He found one item that had been overlooked in the initial investigation, a small newspaper clipping tucked into one of the technical manuals on Chandler's bookshelf. The clipping was from 1963, an article about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the article was still legible. It described the events of November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. Why had Chandler kept this clipping? Elliot wondered if it had personal significance. Had Chandler been in Dallas that day? Had he witnessed something? Or was it simply a memento of a historic event, something that millions of Americans had kept? There was no way to know. But Elliot made a note to have the genealogist pay particular attention to any family lines that had connections to Texas in the 1960s. Another detail that caught Elliot's attention was Chandler's reading habits. Among the books in his apartment were several on World War II, particularly books about the European theater and the Battle of the Bulge. There were also books on cryptography and codes, unusual reading for a man who claimed to have been a simple electrical engineer. Elliot wondered if these interests were related to Chandler's true identity. Had he served in the war in some capacity that involved intelligence or code breaking? If so, there might be classified records somewhere that could shed light on his past. Elliot reached out to military historians and archivists, asking if they could search for any records of intelligence operatives or code breakers from World War II who had subsequently disappeared. The responses were not hopeful. Many records from that era were still classified or had been destroyed. And even if they could find records, there were thousands of men who had served in intelligence roles. Narrowing it down to one specific individual would be nearly impossible without more information. Meanwhile, the genetic genealogists were making slow but steady progress. They had identified several family lines that matched the DNA profile. One line traced back to a family in West Virginia. Another traced to Pennsylvania. A third had roots in Ohio. The challenge was figuring out which of these lines was the right one, and then identifying which specific individual within that line was the man who had died in 2002. The genealogists focused on men born in the 1920s who had at some point disappeared from public records. They looked for men who had stopped filing taxes, stopped appearing in city directories, stopped showing up in any official documentation after the early 1960s. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but they were methodical and thorough. In 2016, they identified a promising lead. In the West Virginia family line, there was a man named, let's call him Robert Miller for the purposes of this narrative, who had been born in 1924. Robert had served in World War II and had returned home to West Virginia in 1946. He had worked various jobs throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. He appeared in census records, city directories, and tax records. But in 1964, he suddenly vanished. There were no more records of him after that year. No death certificate, no obituary, nothing. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. The genealogists researched Robert Miller extensively. They found an old photograph of him from a high school yearbook in the 1940s. when they compared the photograph to the pictures of the man who had called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III. There were some similarities. The shape of the face, the set of the eyes, the prominent cheekbones. It was possible the team reached out to Robert Miller's surviving relatives. His sister, Margaret, was still alive, now in her late 80s. She lived in a nursing home in Charleston, West Virginia. Elliot and one of the genealogists, a woman named Jennifer, traveled to Charleston to interview her. They found Margaret in the common room of the nursing home, a small, frail woman with white hair and sharp blue eyes. When they explained who they were and why they were there, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Bobby," she whispered. "You found my Bobby." Elliot gently explained that they weren't certain, but they believed her brother might be the man they were looking for. He showed her a photograph of the man who had called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III. Margaret studied the photos carefully, her hands trembling. "It's hard to say," she said finally. "He'd be so much older now. But there's something in the eyes." Bobby had eyes like that. Sad eyes, like he was carrying the weight of the world. Elliot asked her to tell them about her brother. Margaret settled back in her chair, her gaze distant as she remembered. "Bobby was the eldest," she said. "There were 5 of us kids. We grew up poor in the mountains. Daddy worked in the coal mines. Mama took in sewing. We didn't have much, but we were happy. Bobby was a good boy. Smart, too. He read every book he could get his hands on. When the war started, he enlisted right away. He wanted to do his part." Margaret paused, her eyes growing darker. When he came back from the war, he was different. He didn't talk about what he'd seen, but you could tell it had changed him. He was jumpy, nervous all the time. He had nightmares. He'd wake up screaming. Nowadays, they'd say he had PTSD, but back then, we didn't have a name for it. We just knew the war had broken something inside him. "What did he do after he came home?" Elliot asked. "He tried to work," Margaret said. "He got a job at a factory, but he couldn't keep it. He'd have these episodes, you know? He'd think someone was following him, or he'd hear things that weren't there. The doctor said it was shell shock, but there wasn't much they could do for him. He started drinking, try and quiet the voices in his head. It got bad, real bad." Margaret's voice cracked, and Jennifer reached out to pat her hand gently. After a moment, Margaret continued. "In the early 60s, Bobby got involved with some kind of government work. He never told us exactly what it was. Said it was classified. He'd disappear for weeks at a time, then come back. He seemed more stable for a while, like having a purpose helped him. But then in 1964, he came to visit one last time. He was agitated, paranoid. He said people were after him, that he'd seen something he shouldn't have, that he needed to disappear. We thought he was having another breakdown. We tried to get him to see a doctor, but he refused. And then one night he just left, took nothing with him, didn't say goodbye. We reported him missing, but the police said there wasn't much they could do. An adult has the right to leave if he wants to. And you never heard from him again?" Elliot asked. Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Not a word. For 60 years, I wondered if he was alive or dead. I always hoped he'd found some peace somewhere. But now you're telling me he might have killed himself." Her voice broke completely. Elliot and Jennifer exchanged glances. "We don't know for certain that your brother is the man we're looking for," Elliot said carefully. "But if you'd be willing to provide a DNA sample, we could find out for sure." Margaret nodded. "If it brings me some answers after all these years, then yes. Please." A cheek swab was taken, and the sample was sent to lab for analysis. The waiting period was agonizing for everyone involved. Elliot had been working on this case for so long that the outcome felt deeply personal. If this was indeed Robert Miller, it would finally provide answers. But if it wasn't, they'd be back to square one. The results came back 6 weeks later. Elliot was at home when he got the call from the lab. His hands shook as he answered the phone. The geneticist on the other end spoke calmly, professionally, but Elliot barely heard the technical details. What he heard was a conclusion. It was a match. The man who had called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III for nearly 40 years was Robert Miller from West Virginia. After 16 years of investigation, the mystery was solved. Elliot sat down heavily, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. Relief, satisfaction, sadness. They all washed over him at once. He thought about Robert Miller, the young man who had gone off to war and come home broken, the man who had struggled with demons he couldn't escape, the man who had eventually felt he had no choice but to erase himself and start over. And even that hadn't been enough to give him peace. Elliot called Margaret to give her the news. She wept on the phone, not with grief, but with a strange mixture of sadness and relief. "At least now I know," she said. "At least now I can mourn him properly." In the days that followed, Elliot pieced together what he could of Robert Miller's story. With Margaret's help, he obtained Robert's military records. Robert had indeed served in World War II, but not in combat. He had been assigned to a signals intelligence unit, working on intercepting and decoding enemy communications. It was classified work and the records were sparse, but it was clear that Robert had been exposed to highly sensitive information during the war. This explained his interest in cryptography and his technical skills. After the war, Robert had struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. He had been diagnosed with what was then called psychoneurosis, a catch-all term for various mental health issues, including what we now recognize as PTSD. He had been in and out of VA hospitals. His family had done their best to support him, but resources were limited and mental health care in the 1950s was primitive at best. In the early 1960s, Robert had been approached by a government contractor who needed people with his skills and security clearance. He had worked on various classified projects for a few years, but according to Margaret, he had become increasingly paranoid during this time. He believed he was being watched, that he had learned something dangerous, that powerful people wanted to silence him. His family had dismissed this as part of his mental illness. But what if there had been some truth to it? What if Robert had witnessed or learned something that made him genuinely afraid? Was that why he felt compelled to disappear and take on a new identity? Elliot reached out to government agencies, trying to find records of what Robert Miller had been working on in the early 1960s. But he hit walls everywhere he turned. Records were classified. Agencies couldn't confirm or deny that Robert had worked for them. It was frustrating, but not unexpected. Even decades later, Cold War secrets remained closely guarded. Elliot was left to speculate. Had Robert Miller discovered something sensitive? Had he been involved in something illegal or immoral that haunted him? Or had his paranoia been purely a product of his mental illness, with no basis in reality? There was no way to know for certain. What was clear was that at some point in 1964 or 1965, Robert Miller had made the decision to become someone else. He had chosen the identity of Joseph Newton Chandler III, a boy who had died in a car accident in 1945. It was a carefully chosen identity. The real Joseph had been born in 1925, the same year as Robert. They were close enough in age that Robert could plausibly claim to be him. The real Joseph had died young, before he had accumulated much of a paper trail, and he had died in New York, far enough from West Virginia that it was unlikely anyone would make the connection. Robert had obtained a copy of Joseph's birth certificate, probably by writing to the Buffalo Department of Vital Statistics and claiming to need a replacement. In the 1960s, such requests were rarely questioned. With the birth certificate, he had been able to apply for a Social Security number. And with a Social Security number, he could get a driver's license, open a bank account, and build a new life. For nearly 40 years, Robert Miller lived as Joseph Newton Chandler III. He worked quietly, saved his money, and kept to himself. He never married, never had children, never formed close relationships with anyone. He was alone, always alone. And perhaps that was how he wanted it. Perhaps the isolation was a form of penance, a way of punishing himself for whatever real or imagined sins he carried. Or perhaps it was simply the only way he knew how to feel safe, to keep the world and its dangers at arm's length. As he aged, the burden must have become heavier, the loneliness more acute, the memories, whatever they were, more insistent. In 2002, at the age of 77, Robert Miller decided he had carried his secrets long enough. He arranged his affairs with characteristic precision, wrote his will, and ended his life. He left no note, no explanation. He took his reasons to the grave, and he would have remained forever a mystery if not for the advances in DNA technology and the determination of investigators who refused to let the case go. Elliot wrote up a final report on the case. He included everything he had learned about Robert Miller, Joseph Newton Chandler III, and the 16-year investigation that had finally brought the truth to light. He sent copies to all the agencies that had been involved and to Margaret, who thanked him through tears for giving her brother back his name. "He was always Bobby to me," she said in their final conversation. "No matter what name he used, he was always my big brother. And now I can bury him properly, with his real name on the stone." The case of Joseph Newton Chandler III, Robert Miller, became something of a sensation in the true crime community. Podcasts were made about it. Articles were written. It was held up as an example of how far someone could go to erase their past and how modern technology could still uncover the truth. But for Elliot, it was more than just a solved case. It was a tragedy, a story of a man damaged by war, failed by a mental health system that didn't understand his needs, and driven by fear, real or imagined, to live half a life in the shadows. Robert Miller had been a real person with a real history, and for 40 years, he had denied himself that history. He had cut himself off from family, from friends, from any kind of human connection. And in the end, the loneliness had killed him as surely as the bullet. As Elliot reflected on the case, he wondered how many others there were like Robert Miller. How many people were living under assumed names, hiding from their pasts, existing in isolation? How many mysteries would never be solved because the people involved had covered their tracks too well? The case also raised questions about privacy and technology. DNA databases and genetic genealogy had made it possible to identify Robert Miller, but at what cost? Some people were uncomfortable with the idea that their DNA, uploaded to a public database to find relatives or learn about their ancestry, could be used by law enforcement. It opened up debates about consent, privacy, and the balance between solving crimes and respecting individual rights. But for Margaret and the rest of Robert Miller's family, those debates were secondary to the relief of finally knowing what happened to their brother. They held a memorial service for him in West Virginia, attended by the few surviving siblings and their children and grandchildren. They buried a small urn containing a portion of his ashes that had been held by the Eastlake Police Department for 16 years. They placed a headstone with his real name, Robert Miller, 1924-2002, beloved brother and soldier. At the service, Margaret spoke briefly. "Bobby had his troubles," she said, her voice wavering but strong. "He saw things in the war that no one should have to see. He came home and fought a different kind of battle, one against his own mind. In the end, he could win that fight. But I want everyone here to remember that he was a good man. He was kind and gentle and smart. He loved his family, even if he couldn't be with us. And wherever he is now, I hope he's finally found peace." As the mourners dispersed, leaving flowers and flags on the grave, Margaret stayed behind. She reached out and touched the cold stone, tracing her fingers over her brother's name. "I forgive you, Bobby," she whispered, "for leaving, for not saying goodbye. I forgive you." And with that, she turned and walked away, her steps slow but steady, a woman who had finally been able to lay her brother to rest after 6 decades of wondering. The story of Robert Miller, the man who became Joseph Newton Chandler III, is more than just a mystery solved. It's a window into the human cost of war, the failures of our mental health system, and the lengths to which people will go to escape their pain. It's a reminder that behind every cold case, every unidentified body, every mystery, there's a real person with a real story. And sometimes that story is almost too sad to bear. In the years since the case was solved, researchers and historians have tried to dig deeper into Robert's work with government contractors in the early 1960s. Some believe he may have been involved in projects related to the Cuban Missile Crisis or early surveillance programs. Others think he may have simply been a low-level technician whose paranoia was entirely a product of his mental illness. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in between. Robert Miller was a man haunted by his past, whether that past included actual secrets or simply the trauma of war and mental illness. He made a choice that seemed to offer escape, but instead, it locked him into a life of isolation even more complete than the one he was trying to flee. His story is a cautionary tale about the cost of secrets and the importance of human connection. It's also a testament to the power of perseverance in investigation and the remarkable capabilities of modern forensic science. 16 years after Robert Miller's death, investigators were able to give him back his name. They couldn't give him back his life, the life he might have lived if he'd gotten the help he needed, if he'd been able to forgive himself for whatever he thought he'd done, if he'd been able to stay connected to the people who loved him. But they could give him back his identity. And in doing so, they gave his family the closure they desperately needed. Today, the case of Joseph Newton Chandler III is taught in forensic science programs as an example of how genetic genealogy can solve seemingly impossible mysteries. It's discussed in veteran support groups as a tragic example of untreated PTSD. It's analyzed in psychology courses as a case study in dissociative identity and the extreme measures people will take to escape psychological pain. But more than anything, it's remembered as the story of Robert Miller, a young man from West Virginia who went off to war and never really came home. A man who tried to become someone else and lost himself in the process. A man who, in the end, couldn't outrun his demons. His story is over now. The mystery is solved, but the lessons remain. We must do better for our veterans, providing the mental health care they need and deserve. We must be more aware of the people around us who are struggling in silence, isolated and alone. And we must never forget that every person, no matter how much they try to erase themselves, matters. They have a name, a history, a family that mourns them. Robert Miller mattered. He mattered to his sister Margaret, who never stopped hoping he'd come home. He mattered to the investigators who spent years trying to discover his true identity. And he matters now, as a reminder of the human cost of war, trauma, and the desperate need to escape. May he finally rest in peace. Thank you for staying with us through this long and complex journey into one of the most puzzling identity mysteries in American history. The case of Joseph Newton Chandler III, or rather, Robert Miller, reminds us that behind every cold case is a human story, often one of pain, loss, and decisions made in desperation. If this investigation moved you, if you found yourself thinking about the man who lived 40 years, as someone else, please take a moment to like this video, share with others who appreciate deep dive true crime investigations, and subscribe to Cold Case Desk. We're committed to bringing you the most thorough, respectful, and compelling investigations into the cases that haunt us. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Was Robert Miller justified in his decision to disappear? Could his paranoia have been based in reality? What would you have done in his situation? And most importantly, how can we better support veterans and others struggling with PTSD and mental health issues? Until next time, remember, every mystery has a solution, even if it takes decades to find it. Every person deserves to be remembered by their true name, and every story, no matter how tragic, deserves to be told. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop searching for the truth. This is Cold Case Desk, signing off.